Heads up.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Press Theatre. I'm Marie Danielle Smith. I'll be moderating today. We're going to start with a statement from Minister Carolyn Bennett, and then we have a Q&A afterwards for which all three ministers, Maryam, Monsef, Carolyn Bennett, and Jane Philpott, will be available. So please, Minister, you can begin.
Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. In particular, we want to thank the moderator as well as Ministers Philpott and Monsef for particularly the minister's ongoing support for this important issue, and as well the roles going forward of Minister Wilson-Raybould and Minister Goodale. I want to begin today by reaffirming that the Government of Canada is committed to ending the ongoing national tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Ending the unacceptable rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and finding the answers their families deserve is a priority. Their photographs are on the front pages of our newspapers. Their names are in the voices of the families and loved ones. Their memories live on in their mothers and sisters and daughters who continue to fight for justice and equality in this country. Right now, we are in the midst of a historic opportunity. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls is the first national inquiry in Canadian history, as the Commission has been mandated by the federal government and all the provinces and territories, all of whom are committed to putting an end to this ongoing national tragedy. All of us share the responsibility to work with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to ensure that Indigenous women and girls are safe in their communities and wherever they choose to live. We are working to make sure that the survivors and families get the answers they have been waiting for. The
work being done by the Commission will produce recommendations that will be concrete and definitive, including the identification of practices that can bring positive change for individuals, families, and communities. It is important to ensure that our country is safe and inclusive for Indigenous women and girls.
Wait for the Commission's final report to put in place the concrete actions that will stop this national tragedy and support the families. The Commission's interim report identified changes that could improve the functioning of the inquiry and address the needs of survivors and families members going forward, and we are taking action in these areas. We will now be able to respond to the Indigenous groups that have expressed concern that they have not had the capacity to fully participate in the inquiry. Minister Philpott and Indigenous Services Canada will invest $21.3 million over 3 years for health supports for survivors and family members of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This will allow the expansion of services to include all survivors and family members impacted by these tragedies, improve their access to health support services, and increase the time frame during which health support services will be available to them. The Family Information Liaison Units have been hugely successful. They work directly with families to help them access information from government agencies about their loved ones, answer outstanding questions they have, and connect them to trauma and grief supports. The Family Liaison Units and the funding of community-based organizations will both be extended by 1 year until March 2020 in order to provide culturally responsive, trauma-informed, community-based services for families. As the inquiry noted in the interim report, public commemoration is a powerful way to honor the truths, achieve healing, create awareness, and to advance reconciliation. Minister Monsef and Status of Women Canada are committing $10 million over 2 years to create a commemoration fund as an initial investment to support local and national commemoration activities. We also recognize the importance of addressing gaps in services to Indigenous people through the criminal justice system and enhancing law enforcement capabilities. We are taking action by supporting the new National Investigative Standards and Practice Unit with an investment of nearly $10 million over 5 years to focus on homicide investigations. Housed within the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, it will act as a national centre of expertise and oversight for high-profile major case investigations, increasing the prospect of successful investigations and criminal prosecutions. We are also providing funding of $1.25 million to organizations with expertise in law enforcement and policing. They will also identify barriers and best practices, develop culturally competent police services that address systemic issues, including sexism, racism, and discrimination, as well as develop training and tools to address gaps in policing. Nous voulons tout comprendre les grands causes.
We want to understand the deep causes of this social epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women that contributed to the pursuit of these problems.
For an extension. This involved extensive discussions with survivors and family members, Indigenous organizations, and provinces and territories. Based on those discussions, we found support for giving the inquiry more time to submit its final report, but little support for the Commission's mandate to extend beyond the next election. By giving the Commission until April 30th, 2019 to complete its report, instead of the initial date of November 1st, 2018, the Commissioners will decide how to use this additional time to hear from the remaining families and survivors, further examine institutional practices and policies, and undertake the research necessary to inform their recommendations on the systemic causes of violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada. After submitting their final report, the Commission will have until June 30th, 2019 to wind down its operations. This approach acknowledges that there are more survivors and family members that want to share their experiences. However, it also underscores the urgency this government places on seeing the Commission deliver concrete recommendations that will address the systemic and institutional issues to help Indigenous women and girls be safe. With this approach, the National Inquiry maintains all of its authorities under the Inquiries Act of Canada and each and every province and territory until December 31st of 2018. That means they can continue to gather evidence, hear testimony, and issue subpoenas for the remainder of the year rather than having to stop all these activities in order to write their report. However, I want to stress again that we are not waiting for the inquiry to finish its work to act. Since the inquiry was officially launched on August 3rd, 2019, we have been making tremendous progress within my own department and across the Government of Canada to make Canada safer for Indigenous women and girls. Dr. Philpott and Indigenous Services Canada continues to invest in housing, education, and the urgent need for transformation of and reform of the child and family services, with the focus on prevention, ensuring children are connected to their language and culture, and keeping families together. Status of Women Canada's gender-based violence strategy is investing in programs to support survivors of violence across the country, including Indigenous women and girls. And the Department of Justice is undertaking a broad review of the criminal justice system that, in part, is looking at ways to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous women and girls as victims of crime. We believe that with the plan that we have presented today, we are taking another significant step forward in addressing what families told me they wanted in our very first meeting over a decade ago. They want justice, They want healing, and they want us to do everything to make sure that not another family has to go through what they have been through. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech. Nakimik. Marcy.
So we'll start with questions. We have from CBC.
Yeah, you mentioned that nobody wanted this inquiry to go beyond the next federal election, but April 30th is long, you know, next year is not. There was a lot of space, so is the reason why you couldn't extend it beyond that is because of the order and councils needed from all the provinces and territories and the federal government to actually allow them to continue gathering evidence? Is that too much work to...
Thank you. There's two things. One is that the orders in council in the provinces and territories only go to December 31st, and if any province and territory did not agree to have those extended, we would no longer have a national public inquiry. And so we took into consideration that, plus what the inquiry had said to us in terms of what time they thought they would need for a report, meaning that they would have to begin now to start to write the report for a November 1st date. And also, I think that we felt that it would be very important for the Government of Canada to have time to respond to the final report before we go into an election. And so I think it is those things that were taken into consideration.
And there's a lot of issues with how the Privy Council and, I guess, billing for elders and traditional healing and all those issues. Has that been worked out yet, or is there still kinks on that? Yeah,
I would say almost 1 week after the interim report, when there was a working group struck of the institutional part of Privy Council office, plus our department, plus the executive director of the commission to work through those problems, and I think we're well on our way to having resolved that. They actually, Jorge, they meet weekly to make sure that that this is that any new things that surface are dealt with right away.
Sorry about that. Manon Cornelier, Le Devoir.
Manon Cornelier, Le Devoir.
The administrative problem that you are on your way to resolve that, which was a problem since almost the beginning of this commission. Does it mean that you will have a problem until the end? But and the fact that it's that shorter, should we see it as a vote of non-confidence in this commission because of all the troubles they have?
Firstly, no. I think that we are very grateful for the work of the Commission, and particularly the interim report that has put us on a very good path to beginning to deal with the issues that had been raised in many reports and series of recommendations in the past. I think that we feel that that we are on a very good path in terms of Privy Council office and the department working with the new executive director of the commission, and I think that this has been very successful.
I have a problem. You said that you will give money to organizations with expertise in policing to identify barriers and good practices. Was it not supposed to be the job of the Commission to do that?
This is in response to their interim report, and so there was a need to, I think, up front as our government, we wanted to deal with the things like racism, sexism, and discrimination within police services, as had been in so many previous reports, and certainly what we'd heard in the gatherings in terms of the pre-inquiry. But the other issue, Manon, is that some of the Indigenous organizations themselves have felt that they didn't have the resources to properly participate. And so groups like Monsef Women and Pautudik, I think they were feeling that they wanted to be able to do some of their own research, and so that there will be money available to the Indigenous organizations to do that work that then could feed into the commission.
Maura Forrest, National Post.
Yes, thank you. The response to the the extension request was very mixed, including from Indigenous organizations. There were some that supported the request, others that wanted no more time to be given. So how difficult was it to balance those views, those opposing views, and do you feel now that everyone is in agreement that this is the right way forward?
Yes, I mean, I think that we have had huge support for this rather creative solution of allowing the Commission to use all of its time right up to December 31st with the Orders in Council in all the provinces and territories, their ability to subpoena us. That as opposed to if they had to have their report due November 1st, that really they had told us they would pretty well have to slow down and start writing now. And so we are giving them really till December 31st to continue their research and be able to listen to families, do the kind of institutional systemic research that they want to be able to make the best possible recommendations. So we feel this is the creative solution in between. They're using the whole of their Orders in Council, but we don't lose any provinces and territories in the process, and they get an appropriate time to write the report.
Why have you not decided how much more money will be required? Is it possible that they could complete their work with the existing budget without any more funding?
That's a conversation we'll have with the Commission going forward, and we will want them to be able to let us know what their needs are and in terms of what their situation is right now. Because they're totally independent, I don't know where they are in their budget right now. So we will be, ready to have that conversation.
Dylan Robertson, the Winnipeg Free Press.
I want to talk about the lack of regional response in what we've seen here today. When it comes to the prairies, you've lost the commissioner who is from the prairies. The Métis government is literally doing a parallel process now because they feel so neglected. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs withdrew its support because it said there wasn't enough of a focus on issues in Manitoba. How do you justify not having anything to address any of those concerns today?
Well, I think the Commission is arm's length, and I think the new executive director, who is from Manitoba, is I think working with the commissioners to make sure everybody feels heard, and with this additional amount of time, I think that we want to make sure that everybody who wants to be heard will be heard, and that again is the job of the Commission, and certainly in the conversations that we have had with them, they are very committed to make sure everybody who needs to be heard feels that they've had that opportunity.
If I may, one of the reasons we're introducing a $10 million commemoration fund over the next 2 years is to work with national, regional, and local Indigenous organizations and communities to ensure that they're part of this process in a meaningful way too. That means that they'll be able to convene communities, to build on existing commemoration efforts, to ensure that the healing and the unity that the interim report suggested would come out of commemoration is included in a grassroots way. It's also one of the ways that we're providing additional resources to organizations on the ground who have been asking for a national inquiry for many, many years.
And Minister Bennett has suggested this would be a good time for me to jump in as well in terms of commenting about some of the proactive work that we've been doing government-wide to respond before the final report comes out on some of the factors that lead to the fact that women and girls who are Indigenous are overrepresented amongst missing persons. And one of the priority issues, as you know, is around child and family services. If you look to reports of of organizations like the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, on their report on bringing our children home, they document the overrepresentation of children who have been in foster care systems amongst those who are missing persons on the streets of Winnipeg, for example. So we have made massive investments in this area, but more than that, we have actually moved to change the policy approach around child welfare so that organizations, agencies who work in child and family services now are fully funded for the prevention work to prevent the apprehension of children. And we're actually seeing some really remarkable work with organizations like the First Nations Family Advocate Office in Manitoba to actually return children to their families. We know that these kids are particularly at risk when they age out of care and are often sent out in the streets without supports and end up amongst missing persons. But First Nations Family Advocate Office has brought literally hundreds of kids back to their homes and communities and families, and this is really important work, which is completely tied into the work that Minister Bennett's leading with the inquiry.
I just think that after the pre-inquiry, there was no question that we had to get going on this complete renovation of the child welfare system, which was a child apprehension system. And as Dr. Philpott says, and as those young people aged out of care, they were really without a safety net. And this is the story we heard at every gathering of the pre-inquiry. And so we felt that we really obviously needed to move with that. And so some of the partners, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Treaty 8 now has its own office on running its own child welfare system for their members on and off reserve. So the prairies have really stepped up on what we think is one of the most significant systemic problems in stopping this tragedy.
We have Madeleine Blem. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and as a follow-up, I was wondering about the terms of reference process, and you have to ask the provinces to get on board. If they don't get on board, there's a bit of a patchwork in extending it past that. Or is that actually going to go ahead? Are you going to be asking the provinces and territories to consent to this, and do you have any time frame for when you'll ask and when they have to respond by?
In the conversations with the provinces and territories, it was clear that I think that we weren't going to get an extension of the terms of reference from some of them, and so this creative solution allows the terms of reference in the orders in council to be honored in all of the provinces and territories, and then we then are able to give extra time for the commission to write its report.
Can you name names? Like which provinces?
Well, those are private conversations, and I think that but it was what I needed to gather in terms of is there a consensus or not to extend the terms of reference or the orders in council. But you need to know if we even lost one, we no longer have a national public inquiry.
Fewer than 5? Like that's the phrase we use. I'll just say that there was not a consensus in any way to extend the terms of reference.
So more than one, though.
Yes.
Okay, Madeleine Blais-Morin, Radio-Canada.
Madeleine Blais-Morin, Radio-Canada. One of the recommendations of the preliminary report was to have a national police unit in order that families be able to call upon it to reopen files. Are you planning on accepting that recommendation? This was a premature recommendation because the meetings to hear from institutions began last week, and they will take place in the future as well. Instead of that, we supported the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to move forward with unresolved cases of missing people?
A website that people can look at. Assistant Commissioner Inquiry has a special unit within the RCMP that can take referrals from the Commission or from others on cases that are have been dealt with in an unsatisfactory way, according to them. So it's that unit, I think, needs time to really sort itself out in terms of whether that will be able to help also other police forces. The support for the major crimes and homicide standard of practice unit, but also the resources to deal with the racism, sexism in all aspects of policing, as well as community safety plans in communities, as well as the restorative justice piece that is happening in justice. We think that there are a lot of moving parts right now, and that it would be premature to call for a task force with all the provinces and territories until we see whether what is in the final report, but also to give these other areas a chance to perform.
The request for extension, I want to make sure, you're saying you did not have a consensus within the provinces. So was that the major reason, or was the election the major reason, or which was kind of the reason for saying no to the 2-year extension?
Well, again, it's a matter of listening to everybody, and I think what we've done is come up with a creative solution where we can be able to provide the Commission with more time to hear from families and to do the research on the institutional systemic issues at the same time as we maintain the integrity of a national public inquiry. And so for the Commission not to be able to subpoena in certain provinces and territories, I think that obviously was important to us, but also I think that from the very beginning, a lot of families had said they didn't want this to drag on forever. They actually wanted this done in a timely way. There have been many reports, many recommendations. They were asking us to put in place the concrete measures to stop this.
Justin Brake.
Yeah, sort of following up from that, I guess, the request was for a 2-year extension and $50 million. There's no guaranteed new funding to the inquiry, and the answer from the government is 6 months. You've just outlined some of the reasons why the decision was made. In any kind of negotiating, whether it's for a mortgage or something more important, coming back with kind of a 25% of what the organization or the inquiry in this case was asking for is, a lot of people would say that's kind of in bad faith. So I'm wondering what was going on in terms of discussions between the government and the commissioners when this extension was being discussed, and what you think we can expect to hear from the Commission itself when they speak now following this announcement today. Is 6 months. You've outlined the reasons why 6 months was the time granted. There's a lot of reasons. There's probably going to be criticism, I think, to say that this seems paternalistic for Canada to say to an Indigenous-led inquiry on an Indigenous tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It seems that Canada's kind of controlling it, even though the Commission's supposed to be independent. You've called it a national tragedy and a top priority. $50 million in 2 years doesn't seem like a lot, considering Canada just paid, $5 billion almost for a pipeline. People are going to be, making these comparisons. What can you say in advance?
Firstly, I think that what we heard from a number of the families, which we we committed to putting families first, that the compilation of the announcements that we're making today is $50 million. And so a lot of the families said to us that they would rather the money went into the concrete actions for seeking of justice, support for families, and actions to make sure it doesn't happen again or the tragedy stopped. So we had many families saying we actually need the supports and the justice now. And it's interesting that in what Minister Wilson-Raybould put together in the family liaison units, that we are seeing such success from those units. So I heard from Ontario that of the 60 families that came forward to the FILU, the Family Liaison Unit, only 6 of them decided to share their experience with the Commission. So it meant that the navigation of the justice system, getting supports, trauma counseling, is happening on the ground because of the initiation of those units that we will extend today, because it's been. So I think that, from the beginning, the Commission accepted the terms of reference that were for 2 years. I think that we feel that that it is about families and also our partners in the provinces and territories, and we feel that today's has given the appropriate extension and a time in which we believe they can get their work done.
Follow-up. I think people might hear that and say, well, this funding that's announced in here is stuff that should be happening anyways outside of the inquiry. And that conflating the two is to indicate that maybe there's no confidence in the Commission to fulfill its mandate rather than announcing funding for what they've asked for. Can you kind of address that? Like, do you have confidence in the Commission or no? And
we have
why?
confidence in the Commission. In fact, it was their interim report that, and in their compilation of the previous recommendations, that has allowed us to move forward in these concrete steps today. So there are other things like I don't know, between Jane's investments in Indigenous housing, that there's no, we're not trying to make it in any way comparative, because we are getting on with these things that are so important, but it is a matter of us feeling that we needed a substantial report, a response to the interim report, while we were getting on with all of these other things that Minister Monsef's gender-based violence strategy, as well as the social determinants and the piece that Dr. Philpott has taken on with gusto.
We said from the beginning, too, that we wouldn't wait till the end of the inquiry to act. And as Minister Bennett said, ultimately, this is about preventing tragedies like this from happening. This is about ensuring that survivors and their families have the supports they need, that the legal systems and the justice systems in place are responsive. That's what we're working on towards with the gender-based violence strategy. We'll be announcing the 1-year anniversary of Canada's first federal strategy to address and prevent gender-based violence. That includes a special focus and filling in of gaps for Indigenous communities across this country, for whom for far too long have not been served adequately. So there's a lot of work underway to ensure that this particular tragedy stops happening, that through the commemoration funds, we ensure that it's placed in the right place in Canada's history, and that the healing that has to be ongoing is led by communities across the country.
Liliane Crête, La Presse Canadienne.
I was wondering if the 6-month extension in your eyes is enough to look at institutional practices. What are your expectations regarding
Well, I think the institutional hearings last week began, and I think that there's been lots written and lots to be determined. But I think that there's no question from my experience in the pre-inquiry that the work that's happening on child and family services and on previous child abuse around addictions is huge in terms of us being able to move on those things right now. And I think that the work that we're asked to do in terms of the interim report that we are putting in place on racism and sex on the policing side, I think goes a long way also for the RCMP and other police services to begin to examine themselves as to the reality of these issues that allow what we saw, a homicide being called a suicide because it wasn't investigated properly. I mean, the stories that we hear, I think now with the new commissioner of the RCMP and with the assistant commissioner Inquiry, a strong Indigenous woman leader of that unit, that we also need all of the institutions to examine themselves. And as I said during the pre-inquiry, this isn't only policing. We are seeing it in our emergency departments, in our child welfare systems. We are seeing it in educational systems, universities, that this racism and sexism is something that we want to deal with directly in terms of all of our institutions in Canada. And as we stand up, and the Reconciliation Council, so I will receive a report from the Interim Reconciliation Council as to how we stand up. So we will then be dealing with these institutional issues that were raised in the TRC calls to action, and that they will be able to tell us which ones we're moving on, which ones we aren't doing so well, and so that will be another accountability mechanism for us dealing with these systemic issues that were raised for a very long time, but particularly in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
So are you saying that because you are taking action, these institutions will not need to do as much like soul searching, or I don't know if I'm expressing it properly, but
the institutions have to admit about the systemic bias and racism that is in pretty well all of our institutions in Canada. And they need to have a look at themselves as we are trying in all of the work on reconciliation. But what we've been asked to support right now is the issues around policing and the issues around the child welfare system and the issues around gender-based violence that will and intergenerational trauma, all of those things that we need to deal with as we go. But I think it's like the commemoration fund that was in the interim report, so we didn't need to wait till the final report to get on with that work.
I'm being told that we have about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to take 2 more questions from the room. I'm sorry if I didn't have a chance to get to everybody, and then if we have time, we'll take a question from the phone line. So Janice Dixon from CP.
Why did it take so long to respond to the interim report?
We had decided that we wanted a substantial report. We needed to be able to go through the processes in terms of all government departments and to be able to secure the funds that would be needed to do this. So it would have been easy to just respond early, but we actually needed to have all the government departments do their due diligence, particularly on the police task force. That took a while for us to really examine the alternatives, decide whether it was appropriate to do it now or after the institutional hearings, and also for us to examine these initiatives that are being put forward, and to find out again the efficacy of these alternatives to the task force. So it really was doing the due diligence on every aspect of it. The one we didn't wait for was the administrative problems, which again, right after the interim report, that working group was struck and they got on with it.
And the delay in terms of the extension, was that because of your conversations with provinces?
Again, and part of it was that we felt it was appropriate to do these two announcements together, so that we were showing the substantial response to the interim report as that fed into the decision around the extension.
Catherine Collins, CBC.
I want to go back to the issue of the police task force. I just wonder more broadly, what do you think it says about the effectiveness of this process that you ultimately are not precisely fulfilling what the inquiry is recommending? I think some people are going to question what that says about the process.
I think that it means that we as a government have to take decisions on tough things, and the police task force would have required, again, the support of every province and territory, and again, we needed to show them that these other initiatives, were effective or not effective in order for us to make a case to have a police task force that would examine all the policing coast to coast to coast. So it is. I'm very excited by these initiatives that have been brought forward, not only by the Commissioner of the RCMP, but also in terms of the racism, and this initiative is very close to what the chiefs of police coast to coast to coast had asked for. So we are responding to these other ideas that have come forward, and also this recommendation for a police task force was done before any of the institutional hearings. So I think we need to hear from the institutional hearings as to whether that is an idea that is supported by them, and so that was the decision we took.
My last question is just a very big picture one. The fact that you are here today announcing this extension, is that a good thing? Is it a frustrating thing? What does it mean?
I think it's a good thing. I think that with in government, we have times where we have to weigh all of what we're hearing. There's going to be disparate voices on all sides, and I think we're coming together today with a creative solution that meets the needs of most of those voices.
This is a good thing for Canada. 3-4 years ago, the acronym MMIWG was not as familiar to communities across Canada as it is now. It wasn't a priority for the former government like it is now. Communities across the country and their local news outlets are learning about the stories of these stolen sisters and mobilizing and urging all of us to take action. We're living in a new era of reconciliation, and today's announcement, as well as the ongoing work of Indigenous leaders across the country, is momentum in this era, and that's a good thing for Canada. It's good for Canadians.
And yet it is a
Can
delay.
I just point out that some people haven't had a question and you already got a follow-up, please? Sorry. And the media advisory says 10:30, so I don't know why we're stopping at 10:15.
Can we go until 10:30?
Sorry, yes, there was supposed to be a vote that got canceled, so sorry, yes.
Okay, good. Maggie Vestal, yes.
To go back on the provinces, you mentioned clearly you don't want to tell us which ones were really enthusiastic about this, but can you relate to us the reasons why there was so much, maybe backlash is too strong a word, but hesitation as to prolonging this inquiry, and why you didn't feel you could even try to get more time than what you got?
Well, firstly, we asked their opinion, and they had different responses. Some electoral cycles, some other realities of the kind of support. Some went directly to their families and asked their families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls what they thought, and then came back to us. And so it was, again, us listening to all of the voices, but also the reality that without an extension in terms of their orders in council, that we would have lost the National Public Inquiry.
And in terms of a budget, do you have a maximum amount that you're willing to give the inquiry? Your bureaucrats said it won't be 2 years, it won't be 50 million. But I mean, between 50,000 and 50 million, there's a big difference. What are you willing to dish out for this extension, and where is your cutoff?
So that decision won't be mine, and again, it will be a matter of how we deal with this in a whole of government approach, and with the central agencies, and be able to have those conversations with the Commission.
Alex Ballingal, Toronto Star.
I wanted the Queries unit. I just wanted to clarify: is that different than the unit that's receiving the $9 million in today's announcement? Are there two RCMP units that could be at play here? Or is that the same one? I just wanted to clarify that.
I think it's the same one. It's a unit that deals with this together, and we're being able to infuse an extra $9 million in there.
And so this dual unit, will it be able to reopen old cases? So it's taking referrals from the inquiry. It will be able to reopen sort of cold cases?
Well, I think their work is to look at cases that were not dealt with in a satisfactory way in the opinion of the Commission or of the families, and for them to figure out what they can learn from those, as well as the Commission was always able to look at clusters of cases to see if there were common threads of bias or whatever. So it will be able to look at these cases to see what we can learn from them. But the Commission itself is not able to assign guilt, right? And so that's always been, a bit of a misunderstanding in terms of what commissions can and can't do under the Inquiries Act.
And just another question on just to clarify, so the end of the year deadline, the creative solution, as you've put it, is basically the Commission will be able to maintain its power to subpoena people and hold hearings until the end of this year, after which point they'll only be able to work on the report, and there won't be any more hearings anymore.
That is correct. So they can continue to hear from families, do hearings, commission research, roundtable, but subpoena till December 31st in all the provinces and territories. Then those powers stop, but then they can anything that doesn't require that, they can continue in their work. They can bring people together to sort out, ideas for recommendation, those kinds of things, until their report April 30th, and then they have 2 months to wind up their work till this time next year.
So we have a few more minutes, and I think there's time for a question from the phone line, if the operator, Ruth, can see if there are any.
Thank you. So once again, please press *1 on the telephone keypad if you have a question. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur l'étoile 1 pour poser une question.
We have about 5 minutes, I think.
We have no question at this time.
Is there anyone else have a follow-up in the room? Jorge Bra, yeah.
I wanted to ask about another women's organization, NWAC. I'm just wondering, there's allegations they've used assets funds to create positions outside of programs that have been approved. They're getting a whole new building, and there's some suggestion that program funding may have been diverted to that. I'm just wondering if, I understand that you guys have received letters about this. I'm just wondering if you're looking into this at all.
The Native Women's Association of Canada, some 15 years ago, received funding from Status of Women Canada, and the project that they were able to deliver on was the Stolen Sisters project, which created a great level of awareness and provided recommendations to the government of the time on how to prevent the tragedy that we are still talking about today. When we fund organizations, regardless of which organization organizations they are. We ensure that we're working with them and that they're following processes around transparency and accountability, and we are very diligent in that work. The specific report that you're referring to, I can assure you that any such allegations, regardless of which organization they're directed at, are taken seriously and reviewed.
Anyone else?
Well, Ms. Bennett, Minister Bennett, my question was, do you have a maximum amount that you're willing to put into this? And you didn't answer. You said we don't know yet. We have to work with the Commission. But I'm sure somewhere someone budgeted a maximum amount. Can you just clarify how high you're going to go? If it's 6 months and they were asking for $50 million for 2 years, should we assume that it should be around $13 million?
The final report has yet to come out. The resources allocated, as the Minister said, are ensuring that the needs of the Commission are met, but more importantly, the needs of the families and the survivors who've yet to tell their stories are met.
So when do you expect to know how much it's going to cost? In June 2019?
This is in budgets. The Commission will have a conversation with us about what they need to do, and that's a conversation that's ongoing. In no budgeting process do we put, no bigger than this, no smaller than that.
Any budget process, you have a number that is your target.
Not in this case. We are going to listen to them and find out what they need. There's no notional number anywhere that I'm aware of.
Madame Benoit, you have a follow-up?
J'ai une question, si possible. En fait, je vais juste essayer de vous demander.
I have a question I'm going to ask you in French. Why 6 months? Why that time frame? It's a creative solution? Because the powers of the Commission in all of the provinces and territories will come to an end on December 31st, and it's very important to have enough time for the hearings with the families, for research work, for meeting with the institutions. But then there is more time required for the drafting.
Bill North of MKO asked that the commissioners have a distributed role. She doesn't have confidence in the chief commissioner. Is there going to be any change to how the commissioners interact with each other?
Well, as you know, the Commission is totally arm's length, and the work that they do amongst themselves is up to the Commission, and so I'm not. It is not up to me to tell them how to work.
Have you been hurt by the fact that, or did you feel sad to see all this infighting at the Commission, the trouble they have, the fact that they have difficulties like to launch their work and get into, how, because you were behind this idea of a Commission since the beginning, so did you feel sad to see all this during those months?
I think that those of us that have been working with families and hearing these stories and the experience for a long time understand how difficult this work is, and how did certain members of the team end up not being able to continue. It's really tough, and I think that it is. I feel sad that the criticism has been personal, and that they're already doing a tough job, and so I think that the families that have been part of the hearings, they say to me how honored honored they were, how heard they felt, how carefully they had been dealt with in again this sort of in ceremony and with trauma informed, and I think any of us who have watched those hearings, like, you can just see the heart and soul of the commissioners there, but all of the support staff, and it is these are, you know, when you think of the, whether it's the work that we're trying to do now with juries or with any of the public servants that have to deal with tough stuff all the time, that we need to give them the room for them to heal and for them to be well.
Did you fear that commission could derail at one point? Did you fear that?
I think that the commission is a very committed group of people who want to get this work done, and so I think that they have been clear that they have a responsibility to do the very best they can for the families and for Canada.
But has it been damaged too deeply to really do the job that people wanted to do? I mean, it lost over 20 employees, it lost the commissioners, lost 2 executive directors. Their lawyers have quit. I mean, last year was a really rough year, and there was concern that it would be. So a lot of lost time, a lot of internal conflict. What impact do you think this will have for it to actually fulfill the mandate that it's...
We've always said that we would put the families first, and I think that the families that have participated and felt heard have given this commission a very good report, and so we now need to make sure that the institutional hearings and the systemic causes are dealt with. But I think that as we did from the beginning, we felt that striking this commission was the right thing to do, and we are grateful for the good work, and particularly the interim report that has given us a real foundation with which to move forward, and then I hope next spring we'll be able to come forward with our response to their final report.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, everybody.